Let's go back to our top story, of course. It is our breaking story where Netcare 911 responded to reports of a collision on the N3 southbound between the Peter Brown and Chatterton Road off-ramps in Pietermaritzburg. This was in the early hours of this morning.
That's right. Reports indicate that 2 trucks, a bakkie, 2 minibus taxis and 5 other cars were involved in a collision, resulting in a fully laden taxi bursting into flames. We are joined now by Shawn Herbst from Netcare 911. Shawn, thank you so much for your time this morning. Can you just give us a little bit of insight in terms of exactly what happened earlier this morning?
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you for having me. Well, as mentioned, reports had indicated that 2 trucks, a bakkie, 2 minibus taxis and 5 other cars were involved in a collision on the N3 between the Peter Brown off-ramp and the Chatterton Road off-ramps in Pietermaritzburg. When rescuers arrived on scene, the fire had spread to other vehicles and had completely engulfed the taxi with all the occupants on board. There were members of the public that had stopped to try and assist getting people out the taxi before it caught alight. While on scene, another secondary collision had occurred on the northbound carriageway, which completely left emergency personnel scrambling. We'd already used all the support that we could for the first collision. The second collision then occurred, then emergency workers had to jump over the centre median to get to the other collision. Sadly, at the time of the release, it wasn't known how many occupants were in the taxi at the time, but they had all sadly burned to death. The accident and investigation unit is on scene at the moment. Once they've done their part, the fire and rescue with the police search and rescue unit will then cut the taxi apart, cut the vehicles apart, and start removing the bodies to actually do the count. Multiple people were treated on scene, not just for burns. Remember, there were 5 other vehicles involved as well. Multiple were treated for their injuries and have been removed to hospitals in the Pietermaritzburg area. I
imagine, Shawn, of course, this would still be affecting traffic. You're, of course, not a traffic official, but I take it there would be different routes that motorists are being urged to use, because I imagine this is closed off the entire N3.
It had at one stage. Traffic authorities have done an amazing job in trying to reroute the traffic. At the moment, the northbound lane is open. The southbound lane is also open, just closed down to 1 lane. A lot of the heavy motor vehicles have gone and taken the old Hilton Road off-ramp to try and avoid the N3.
Yeah, Shawn, it's never an easy sight, one might imagine, to have to witness in these early hours of the morning. Do we have an official number as yet in terms of how many people are injured, how many people are deceased, and have some of these family members actually been notified as yet?
When it comes to those that are injured, we don't have an exact amount, as motorists, as mentioned, motorists had stopped beforehand to try and assist. Where possible, they put some of the injured people in the vehicles, in bakkies, and had rushed them through to hospitals. So the exact number we'll only be able to find out most likely this afternoon, when we get a clearer picture as to what exactly had happened. Because, as I mentioned, a lot of the people had already been removed when we arrived on scene.
Just for purposes of clarity, once again, is it just the taxi that caught fire, or other cars, of course, did catch fire? And how bad were these other cars that had caught fire?
Well, from the looks of things, being an expert at that, but it looks like the fire had started with the taxi and subsequently had caught the vehicles that were around the taxi had eventually caught alight as well.
Sure.
So it's not bad. Well, I mean, again, you're saying you're not an expert, and understandably so, but I'm just wanting to find out with the other cars, that of course were victims because of this taxi, the damage to these cars is not bad. I mean, would we know if the motorists in those cars managed to make it out?
All those motorists had managed to make it out. Obviously, there was a lot of injuries involved as well. They were treated by many of the different EMS companies that were on scene. A lot of damage to the vehicles, though. If you've got any images, which I have sent through, you'll be able to see some of the vehicles, and they are absolutely torn apart, crushed between concrete and heavy motor vehicles. If you have a visual of the taxi as well, you can see the carnage. It was terrible.
Yeah, as we're seeing, the visual images on our screen, it just looks somewhat of just a horrific accident as yet. And Shawn, I know that you were saying that in terms of the numbers that have been injured, you do not necessarily have an exact number as yet, and therefore, we're not able to even notify exactly which family members need to be notified and how of the like. Do we know how many people have been deceased or are deceased at the scene? Have those numbers as yet been tallied?
No, not as yet. The scene, it's quite a graphic scene. In cases like this where people do end up burning to death.
Sure.
Sometimes it becomes difficult to try and figure out which part is which. Whether it's male, female, adult. That's only going to be done once the vehicle has been taken apart and the body is removed.
Emergency personnel, Shawn, how are they dealing at the moment? I mean, I suppose this would probably be a question you think to yourself, this is our job, we do this all the time, but I think it's a question that probably doesn't get asked often enough, and maybe we, as people, should be asking the question, how are the emergency personnel who responded and were first to respond to the scene, how are they dealing?
I think the guys do this job for a particular passion. They want to be there to save people, and I think they understand the risks involved, both mentally and physically. There's always means for debrief. A lot of the guys will do self-debrief. There's always channels for discussion if things become too much for a person to handle emotionally. But there are avenues.
Yeah. Shawn, as I said, it's a very difficult conversation to have, especially when we find out that this amount of people are deceased, though we do not necessarily have the tally as yet, and so many more people have been injured. We'll leave it there for now, but as we said, this is a developing story.